It's clear that the racial disparities and inequities that exist in the economic system are not well understood, and yet they persist. And they persist in the wealthiest nation in the world. And it doesn't matter whether we're in good times or bad times in terms of the economy of the United States, we continue to see this lagging gap.
Slavery is the first institutional economic system that we had in America. Upwards of $14 trillion were made of free labor off of Black people in America. That wealth was inherited by white Americans across the country. That is an amount of wealth that you cannot just replace with one individual policy or one check. It's all about a complete structural reform.
Thank you all so much for being with us for our fourth conversation in our action series as part of our Truth, Action, and Reconciliation conversations. This week, we talk about economic equity and work being done on several fronts to address economic disparities. Our fantastic panel today will be led by Fern Mandelbaum, who is a managing director at Emerson Collective, where she leads investments in early stage companies. She also teaches at Stanford's Graduate School of Business, including courses on equity by design. Joining her will be Bill Bynum, who is the CEO of Hope Credit Union and a member of EPU's National Advisory Council. He was a 2019 Emerson Collective Dial Fellow and has served on the boards of the Aspen Institute, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and the William Winter Institute for Racial Reconciliation. Maria Colacuccio is the CEO of Cineo, an HR analytics company focused on fairness in the workplace, especially around equal pay. Maria also co-founded smartsheets.com and is currently a 2020 Emerson Collective Dial Fellow. And finally, Garnisha Ezediaro, who leads the Greenwood initiative at Bloomberg Philanthropies, which is an effort to accelerate the pace of wealth accumulation for Black individuals and family. Thank you all, panelists. Welcome to you all. And now, Fern, to you for a fantastic conversation.
Thank you, Mitch. I am really honored to be here today with our distinguished panelists. As Mitch mentioned, I teach a number of classes at Stanford. Right now, I'm teaching entrepreneurship from diverse perspectives. We have 34 guest speakers this quarter, and all are from HUGs, historically underestimated groups. 31 are people of color, 24 are Black. They are all amazing, inspirational, and inclusive leaders. As Mitch said, I also head up early stage investing at Emerson Collective. We invest in entrepreneurs who are having tremendous impact. Of the 21 investments we've made this year, 18 are founders from HUGs. 8 of them are Black. They are all incredible leaders. There's not a pipeline problem. There are systemic problems and pathway problems. Let's dig in. Panelists, during our truth conversation on economic equity, Angela Glover Blackwell said that it's clear that the racial disparities and inequities that exist in the economic system are not well understood. And yet, they persist in the wealthiest nation in the world. And it doesn't matter whether we're in good times, bad times, in terms of the economy of the United States, we continue to see this lagging gap. Please share if you agree with her sentiment and what do you believe are some of the ways racism is operating within our economic system. Bill, can you start us off, then Maria, and then Garnisha?
Absolutely, and thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this conversation, to be here with such distinguished colleagues on the panel. I more often than not, agree with Angela. She's brilliant, and I think her insights are spot on. We have long seen how these challenges create opportunity gaps, particularly, and I love your term, HUGs, historically underrepresented groups, not underestimated, but I do think that it is very clear that for centuries we've seen how people of color have not had the opportunity to realize their potential. And as we are becoming more diverse as a country, it is increasingly evident that it is in our collective interest to address these disparities. We cannot thrive as a nation if we leave the majority of an increasingly Black and brown population without the tools to support their families, to contribute to the economy. I don't think it matters which side of the political aisle you're on. It's in our collective interest to make sure that we close these gaps.
Maria, can you add your thoughts?
Sure, of course. Thank you, Bill, for kicking us off in such an insightful way. And thank you for having me today. I'm really also very honored to be here. When I think about the systemic issues, because of what our company does, I think about the pay gap and the fact that for decades, policymakers, activists, and workers have fought to close the gender and race pay gap, but pay disparities persist. And many of the women and or people of color here know that because we've lived it. And when the World Economic Forum puts out research and predicts that this pay gap is set to stick around for another 200 years, I think we have to take a moment to step back and ask ourselves, why? Why is this persisting when we know it exists? There are ways to solve it, and there are ways to address it today. So I think that is one of the clearest indicators to me, in addition to everything else we're seeing as COVID erodes the incremental progress that we've made against these problems. We've got to step back and ask ourselves, why are these problems persisting? And how can we start to take action as a community of leaders, specifically in companies and elsewhere, to address them right now?
And I would just follow, thank you again, Fern, and to the organization who are represented here as well as hosting us. I would just add to Maria and Bill's comment, just this idea of the inequities not being understood. And so when I think about action, I think about what we need to do to get to a better understanding. And the first is we have to have more conversations about race and the history of this country. I think this moment has created an environment where now we are a little bit more willing to have those conversations. But the reality is many of us don't have the language or the openings that we are or not even pushing for them to actually reckon with what has happened in this country and how the economic system was built. You know, the second thing is we also have to acknowledge and not have it be a sidebar that certain groups are operating every day within systems that devalue their humanity and anything they produce. And I know you've had, other panelists that have talked about the devaluation that's happening around Black and brown people that sit at the center of this inequity, continued inequity. And then the third thing that, just comes up for me is investing in data that allows us to have a factual and a reliable lens around what's really happening day to day within systems. Even for conversations like this, we have to understand that it's no longer, acceptable for us to pontificate. We really have to understand and know a lot more to be able to democratize data, disseminate it, and really use it to interrogate what's happening in communities across this country and really around the world.
Yeah, thank you all. Gosh, having you all here today, I just would love if you could share a little bit more about your work and how you believe its innovations can lead to long-term systems change. How can you get others involved and create more coalitions and movements to get to the root of these historical challenges and begin to address them? Maria, if you could kick us off, then Garnisha, and then Bill.
Of course. So what the company, I'm the CEO of Cineo, and what we do is we use technology to help companies analyze and resolve pay gaps due to gender, race, ethnicity, or the intersectionality of any or all of those things. And I think it's a really important step because what it shows is that the current solutions, as I talked about previously, that are perpetuating this pay gap and setting this prediction that it's set to stick around for 200 years are all solvable. And they're solvable through innovations in technology and many of the things that Garnisha mentioned around innovation and data collection and analytics, we have the tools at our fingertips. So now the question is, will we work together to dismantle some of the systemic issues that are causing companies to be remiss or potentially scared to address the issues within their own companies? So I'll give you an example. There's a legal risk element to pay equity, obviously, which is why a lot of companies go to a law firm and they look at it underprivileged, because they're afraid, they're scared of what they will find, and they're scared of lawsuits. They're afraid of the multi-million-dollar remediation that they might encounter. But what we're finding is quite the opposite. Employees are so embracing of employers who, with transparency, step up and commit to accountability and fairness, that typically the lawsuits that occur when a company is proactive about addressing systemic racism around pay in their company are almost zero. So I think we've really got to empower and encourage leaders to take the risk to look under the hood and use technology to find problems and fix them, and understand that if they do that proactively with the right intent and communication, they will be rewarded by their employees. And that's a lot of what we do as a company.
So great to hear that. I'm so interested to continue to learn about the work that Maria is doing. So I am a member of the team at Bloomberg Philanthropies. And, you know, Bloomberg Philanthropies has had history of working with cities and partners across the world to improve the quality of life of individuals through a variety of different ways. But the initiative that I am leading came out of Mike Bloomberg's campaign for president, when he set forth a bold policy called the Greenwood Initiative, inspired by the legacy of those businesses that have tried to recover and quite honestly were destroyed during the Tulsa race massacre. And so that policy was designed to leverage the full power of the federal government around Black intergenerational wealth. When the campaign ended, Mike decided to bring that initiative back to Bloomberg Philanthropies. And so for the last period, we have been really wrapping our heads around this issue and the systemic issues that lead to the underinvestment within Black communities, Black families, Black neighborhoods, and for Black individuals. And so we aren't quite there yet in terms of moving into a space of funding, but we're spending the time to really examine this issue, which is necessary when you think about action. You know, and Mike made this commitment, let me say, before the pandemic really took toll, before the events of this summer that have led to the conversation. And we are really taking the time to explore what are the drivers for Black intergenerational wealth, what are the systems and policies that are most extractive out of the community. And we're looking for ways to innovate and disrupt. And that is something that we're super excited about, and we're really thinking about and being intentional about partnering and thinking about who we will work with as a part of this effort.
You know, it's really great to hear my colleagues talk about taking action on these issues. I mean, it's important to have these conversations, but ultimately we have to do something to improve conditions. And I really appreciate that focus. It's what we've been trying to do here at Hope for a little more than a quarter century. I work with Hope Enterprise Corporation, Hope Credit Union, Hope Policy Institute, a family of organizations that really exist to mitigate the extent to which issues like race and gender, where you were born, who your parents happen to be, determine your ability to climb the economic ladder. And we work in a region that is really the belly of the beast with regard to racial disparities, economic distress, poverty in the United States. Work in Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Tennessee. And if you look at this region and look at it over centuries, it's where you had so many of the racial challenges that this country is still working to overcome, as well as the issues of economic distress. If you look at a map, Atlantic generated a map of the United States prior to these onset of the Civil War, and it showed where slaveholding was concentrated the greatest. Well, if you overlay that map with a map today of where you have places that have had poverty more than 20% for not 3 decades in a row, which is the federal definition of persistent poverty, but a half a century, they're pretty much the same areas. And if you look at where you have the worst education outcomes, home ownership conditions, fewest grocery stores that sell healthy produce, the highest numbers of payday lenders and financial predators, and the fewest number of bank branches, they're the same by and large. And so this is deep, entrenched, rooted discrimination, extraction of wealth and opportunity from a region that is predominantly people of color. Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana have the highest percentages of Black population in the country. And so that's not a coincidence that those conditions exist in a region that is predominantly Black. And so we have used financial services as a tool, because whether it's education, health, anything that creates a laddered opportunity, at some point you need financial tools. And those are disproportionately not available to people of color and low income people. It's not just Black folk. We're in the poorest part of the country. So we have a lot of poor Black white folk. We have an increasingly large Latino population. We have native tribal lands in our region, and they're in the same boat. Unfortunately, we see a lot of efforts to divide and make those folks believe that their interests are not aligned. And I think that's why the work of E Pluribus Unum is so important, to help us understand that we are all in this together. And so what we do, our piece of the puzzle, is to try to make sure that people have the financial tools to address those gaps and to support their families and support the economy. It's the same thing that Dr. King was advocating for in Memphis, to make sure that families have the opportunity to support themselves and contribute to the economy, shifting from voting rights, which we still have voting rights challenges, but to really expand the civil rights movement to include economic justice.
Wow. I want to spend so much more time with all of you to learn more about what you're doing. And so this next question is just to help us even understand the next steps we can take. As we all believe that we must prove that there's an incentive for all Americans to close the racial wealth gap. Share with us if you agree with this sentiment, and what are some of those steps we all can take to close the gap. And then Garnisha, if you could kick us off, then Bill, then Maria.
Thank you, Fern. You know, the data that we're looking at shows that if 4 key racial gaps for Black people were closed 20 years ago, we would have added $16 trillion to the US economy. Those gaps in wages, education, housing, and investment. If you think about today, if those gaps were closed, we would be adding $5 trillion to overall US GDP in the next 5 years. You know, do I think, to answer your question, that every American needs to understand this and get the business case around equity? Not necessarily. I mean, I think there's a moral imperative here that we have to be much more concerned about, and that we've seen as a result of this pandemic that, you know, if there's inequity for any group, it threatens us all. And that we also have an opportunity to intervene and should be called, should I say, to intervene, because there is opportunity abound in every system we think about, from education to the environmental justice movement and everything that's happening there, to looking at entrepreneurs. I mean, there are so many places for us to actually take action. And I think it's really about looking at what your organization, you know, within your workplace, and really seeing how you can start in both little and small ways. I think it's about disruption. And, you know, it's also about finding the places that everyone is not looking. And so quickly, I'll just share with you, you know, this summer through the Greenwood initiative, we decided to look at the issue of Black doctors. And that resulted in, you know, as Mike heard, the data and the disparities around health equity, and how Black doctors actually extend, the life expectancy, because they are treating and resonating with Black patients at such more of a higher rate, and those health outcomes and receipt of preventative care. It's 34% more likely to get preventative care if you're seen by a Black doctor. When we looked at that data, we knew there was a point of a disruption, something that we could do about it. And so we made a $100 million investment in partnership with the 4 Black medical schools, because those schools have produced more Black doctors in the last 10 years as the top predominantly white institutions. And so if you break that investment down, it is about both the debt relief that goes to those doctors and allows them to be in choice about where they practice and what they choose to specialize in. But that investment also is about partnering with these institutions who have not necessarily received the partnership and the investment as many other schools, right? We overlook these particular institutions. And so when I think about action, when I think about where we can close the gap, one of the things that we are pushing for at Bloomberg Philanthropies is to look for, new partners, new opportunities, and ways for us to get in front of this issue and partner to really drive towards incremental change.
It is, guys, there's so many threads I could go down, but I want to go back to the point that you made, or question you raised before, Fern, about collaboration. I really think that's important. Nonprofits like mine I'm proud of every loan that we make, every person we get into a responsible financial relationship. I know that at the end of the day, we are dropping the bucket relative to the need. And when you look at the traditional banking system, it's really important that we move those systems. We use the example, the R&D function that we play as nonprofits to inform and shape policy. That's why we have a policy arm. We take data, we take the stories from people in Selma, which is still the poorest town in Alabama, 60 plus years after John Lewis marched across the bridge with Dr. King. And in the Mississippi Delta, we take those voices to banks, to policymakers, and let them know that these towns, the people who live there, need the same things that people in affluent communities need, but they're disproportionately absent. And that if we are intentional about providing them with access to these tools, people in the Delta, people in the Black Belt, people on native lands can do anything that anyone else can do, but we are leaving so much of our capacity on the table, and is hurting us in an increasingly diverse country. We've been fortunate to collaborate with several allies across the country. There's a Partnerships for Rural Transformation. It's other community development financial institutions in native lands, on the U.S.-Mexico border, in Central Valley, in Appalachia, poor white, Indian, Latino, here in the Black Belt and the Delta. But we have so much in common, and we are collectively going to our members of Congress, going to the major banks, going to foundations. It's important to say the foundations can do a lot more, because when you have $40 per capita investment in the Delta relative to $4,000 per capita in Silicon Valley, $3,000 per capita in the U.S., we're really getting what we pay for or don't pay for in terms of where we invest. And banks are similarly investing in places where they can check their Community Reinvestment Act box. And we know, and I think Bloomberg did an analysis several years ago that showed that after the financial crisis, 95% of the banks branches that closed in the country were in low-income census tracts, particularly communities of color, and that's where banks get regulatory credit for investing in places where they have a bank branch. Not that they don't generate revenue from communities in the Delta in the Deep South, but the incentives don't align with and drive the investment where it's needed greatest. And so collaborating with other allies across the country to elevate the voices of the people in the communities we serve is really important. There are several groups that I'm seeing that are coming together: African American community development or community development financial institutions, rural groups in rural persistent poverty areas, and aggregating those voices, I think, is particularly important at this time.
Yes.
Thanks, Bill. I think that coalition aspect is so important, because that's how, if we all band together across different communities, whether it's nonprofit or philanthropy or corporate America, that's when we can start to learn each other's language and speak to each other in a way that makes sense to each of those communities. I think, speaking from a little bit of a different perspective and speaking from the business perspective and leadership in businesses, I want to just share quickly a couple of the statistics that were recently released by the leanin.org and McKinsey report that came out last week, called Women in the Workplace, specifically around Black women and what they're facing in the workplace. So what they found is that in addition to the heightened pressure, Black women who are mothers and senior leaders are experiencing additional factors because they're dealing with emotional fatigue regarding all of the things that are happening in the macro environment, starting most recently 5 months ago with the murder of George Floyd, but obviously going on well before that. And for many of them, work is not a supportive place. So the statistics were quite dire in that fewer than 1 in 3 Black women report their manager had checked in on them in light of the racial violence that was going on. And they're far less likely than white colleagues to say they have strong allies at work. And I think the last one that I'll mention before moving to the incentive part is that compared to other employees, Black women feel more excluded at work, and they're less likely to say they can bring their whole selves, which speaks to, if you think about DEI, which is a big corporate initiative and really has been for the last 10 years, it's diversity, equity, and inclusion, with the I being inclusion. And what we're seeing is, in light of the recent pandemic and racial injustice, the I is getting worse. People are feeling less included because they're having tremendous emotional fatigue and they're not able to bring that with them to work. So how do we incent our leaders to have goals that will actually drive more inclusivity, transparency, and diversity at work? It's a really tough thing to do because you're essentially trying to incent empathy. And how can you incent with financial goals empathy for someone to actually try and put themselves into others' shoes? I think you can do a lot through training, but I think financial incentives are important when you think about diversity, and that is something that we can do. So if you think about it, Satya Nadella, Microsoft CEO, 1/6 of his cash bonus is determined by how well he achieves the diversity goals for the company. And other organizations are starting to follow suit. But as part of that incentive, right now, the same survey found that only 2.6% of companies tie some portion of their senior leaders' compensation to goals that have to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I think there is a tremendous opportunity there to say, okay, we're going to do the best we can to try to teach empathy and teach understanding about what people are actually going through when they come to work and how can they bring their full selves to work. And then on the flip side around diversity, these are goals we can attach analytics and data and metrics to, and then attach incentives that are financial. And so there's somewhere in between those two spectrums where I think using incentives, we can make quite a bit of progress in the corporation.
I just love how specific you're all getting. And so we're going to try to go one level deeper. How do we start to reconstruct the systems that created these gaps in the first place, such as racial segregation in the housing, credit finance, and often subtly in corporate America? Bill, if you could start us off, then Maria, then Garnisha.
That is the question. I recently participated in a similar forum hosted by the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank and talked about innovation. And, you know, it's really interesting. I've come to the conclusion over nearly 4 decades of lending in underserved communities that this is not rocket science. There are only so many ways that you can get capital to places where it's needed. It's a matter of intent. And so I shared that I thought the most significant innovation that the financial service sector could make would to be inclusive and actually lend to people of color at levels comparable to how they lend to white borrowers. I think that's the bottom line. I think it is important, though, that there are steps taken to address the culture, and you can't address what you don't see. And if the governing boards of these major institutions that determine where resources go and don't go don't have diversity, then that's going to permeate throughout the culture of these organizations. If people in the C-suites are not diverse, and if you look at the major banks in the company, they are woefully white male, certainly not close to what representative of the population as a whole. And you can see the impact of that as we navigate this triple crisis, this health crisis, economic crisis, and a racial justice crisis. And the programs that were put in place, the Paycheck Protection Program, the initial rollout was woefully inadequate. And depending on a financial system that has a terrible record of redlining, of pushing back against regulation that supports fair lending, and at a time when we see so many things that we thought were settled doctrine, the Community Reinvestment Act I mentioned, fair lending, disparate impact, simply reporting who you lend to and don't lend to, those are under siege. And we need the banking sector to step up and to not only act in a way that is responsible and inclusive, but to advocate for policies that broaden inclusion and opportunity. I think it's really critical, again, that in order to make that happen, we see more intention, more action in getting diversity into key decision-making positions in these, and not only in banks, but in corporations. I'm really encouraged by the business roundtables, restated purpose of a corporation, an economy that works for all Americans. I think, though, it's really critical that we challenge them, as we've talked today, that it's not just words, but it's actions. I saw today where JP Morgan Chase came out with a major initiative. We've seen Citibank come out with initiatives and Wells Fargo. I think we really need to analyze those numbers to see, does it just move the chairs around on the deck, or does it close the racial wealth gaps in the country? I think if it doesn't, then we need to hold them accountable to actually not just seeing more. We've incremental ourselves into one of the most severe crises in the history of this country. We're not going to get out of it with incremental efforts.
I'm just going to add on a little bit of what to what Bill said. I mean, I think there is an opportunity for some leapfrogs. Like, we need to actually, do some reparative investments that allow us to have a focus on policies and practices that privilege whiteness, and that lead to a situation where, there are things at every level of policy and practices within institutions that are generating wealth for one group and not for another. And so there's no equity there. I think at the center of this conversation is also just partnership and accountability. And so, what do I mean by that? Thinking about, we cannot rely just on Black people in spaces that don't necessarily resonate with them, make room for their voice or opinion to lead the charge here. I'm not saying that we don't need more inclusion, but I think we can't, there needs to be accountability from people of all backgrounds and people who are in places of influences and authority here around these issues. And so that's why I think both the data and the dialogue that we talked about before are really important. And then I also think there are a lot of organizations like Bill's, like Maria's, that are doing this work already and that are practiced in it, right? And that have been for a long time looking at equity issues that, we need to have more partnerships with, across sector, multi-sector partnerships and place-based partnerships so that we can be looking at the regional and the local nuances that are happening and that need to be solved for on the backdrop of national policy and historic practices that have done this again and again and again. So, I think accountability, partnership, really supporting and bringing in those voices who have been committed over time, and, having a real and fair examination of the practices and policies that we know, thread through all of our institutions.
Thank you, Bernicia. I couldn't agree more. I think some of the systemic issues are solvable by more legislation that requires accountability, specifically for companies. We have 44 state laws right now around pay equity, equal pay. We have the Federal Equal Pay Protection Act. We have the Lilly Ledbetter Act. And so you would think that these would require accountability and compliance from companies. And the fact is sometimes they do. But the truth is, with that legislation, the ones I just mentioned, all the onus is still on the plaintiff, which means if you're a person in a company, you have to go gather the research and the comparative data to show and prove that you're underpaid before you can even bring a claim to the EEOC. So how can we look at some countries like Australia or the UK or Sweden that are actually going further to say, if you're a company with 100 employees or more, you need to proactively do some reporting and have accountability on an annual basis to show us that you are paying fairly, that you don't have disparities based on gender, race, ethnicity, et cetera. And that's something that just from an accountability and transparency perspective takes the weight off the people who are actually experiencing these disparities and puts it on the company. And I think that's part of what we need to do to dismantle this systematic racism that's happening in our companies today, is we've got to add some accountability. I think the second piece of this that's really interesting goes beyond legislation. And again, it looks at promotion and development. So if you don't have a specific path and roadmap and plan to get to how you are going to promote more women or more non-white humans into your senior vice president suite, if you just have sort of an aspirational goal of by 2026, we're going to magically be there, you will not be there. You won't be even close. So how do we enable companies through accountability to put their money where their mouth is? If you have a goal of helping developing your administrative level, which is primarily non-white, to get up to a manager level, how do we make sure that you're held accountable in doing that along the way?
Yeah, thank you. Wow, I just looked at the clock. I have like 400 more questions. So what I'm going to try to do is now direct some to individuals. Bill, I'm going to start off with you. Of course, if others want to add, please do so. During our truth conversation on economic equity, Danielle Solomon said that slavery is the first institutional economic system that we had in America. Upwards of 14 trillion were made of free labor off of Black people in America. That wealth was inherited by white Americans across the country. That is an amount of wealth that you cannot just replace with one individual policy or one check. It's all about a complete structural reform. In these conversations on reparations, what have been some of the common themes and most attainable solutions presented?
It is so broad, the implications and the effects of systemic racism. I think reparations is important. We've got to repair the damage that has accumulated over centuries, and it has permeated every aspect of American life. As I said, as a financial institution, we believe that financial resources are necessary to address almost every means that someone needs to climb the ladder and become more economically mobile. And I don't think that there's any aspect of life that has escaped the need for repair, reparations, if you will. We recently worked with Netflix. Netflix invested $10 million, deposited $10 million into our credit union. And many wonder what's the impact of something like that. But when you work in a town like Itta, Mississippi, in the heart of Mississippi Delta, or Selma, Alabama, and when you look at the total deposit potential of the residents in those communities, Itta is just $1.25 million. 5 fully insured federal deposits of $250,000 each would outstrip all of the deposit, all the wealth in that community. And $1.25 million is not enough to support, to address the housing, the healthy food needs, the healthcare needs, community facilities, the business development that's needed in places like Itta and Selma and across the region. These are places where wealth has been systemically extracted over generations, and a deposit is one way of importing capital into these communities. A deposit by itself is inadequate because banks also need equity. And we talked earlier about the wealth gap. So you have a 10-to-1 wealth gap, Black households to white households. Duke and Northwestern researchers recently documented a 100-to-1 gap when it's Black families with children compared to white families with children. 100-to-1 wealth gap is not going to be overcome with a few announcements, with moving the chairs around on the deck. It takes serious transformative levels of investment at the private sector, at the philanthropic sector, and the public sector. Recently, we've seen with the CARES Act, the many public federal programs are put in the hands of state governments to execute. Well, we've seen this disparities in how policy plays out in different parts of the country. In the Deep South, here in Mississippi and in Alabama, CARES Act resources that are necessary for families for towns and counties to buy PPEs, to do things that save lives and get their economies back on track, they have to be they're allocated on a reimbursement basis. Well, when you're a Black Belt town or a Delta county, you already are woefully poor, and now your economies have been obliterated because of the pandemic. You don't have the money that a wealthy, predominantly white county would have. And so policy often widens the gap rather than closes the gap. And then you have organizations like ours who have stepped in and provide bridge loans to these counties so that they can buy the PPEs to get reimbursed with their own tax dollars. Policy, equity at the policy making and policy implementation level are critically important as well. So I just think there's so many elements that need repair, but it starts with acknowledging that there's a need, that there are systemic challenges that confront us, and putting people in positions to make those decisions. I talked about the leadership within corporate America. Also, we can't ignore leadership in the public sector. 85% of the members of Hope Credit Union voted in the last election, compared to 58% of the general population. That tells me that when people have a stake in the game, when people are a homeowner, when they have a bank account, when they feel like it makes a difference in their lives and their communities, they're more civically engaged. They go to their town council, they go to the PTA meeting, they vote at higher rates. We just have left so many people outside looking in. We got to empower people to take control of their own lives, and we'll see better outcomes.
Thank you, Bill. Garnisha, one of the goals of the Greenwood Initiative is to collect better data on hiring, pay, procurement, and lending. What type of data exists today, if any, and how does your initiative plan to fill the gaps?
Thank you, Fern. I will say that as we look at, the drivers overall of wealth, and I told you we've been in the process to look at this deeply, and even that goal, I think, was highlighted in the policy, during Mike's campaign. But as we bring this initiative over to the foundation, we're looking at, that the path to wealth for Black people is not as simple as, assets minus liabilities. That in fact, you have to think about the narrative change that needs to happen, right? And the departure from narratives like, you have to pull yourself by your bootstraps, or that, when it comes to Black businesses and procurement, that we are not as equipped or ready or as capable. Right. And so, we're looking at this problem and starting to think about not only the data, but the narratives that also will need to shift. We're looking at and thinking about sort of the socioeconomic factors that lend themselves into what some people term as the cost of being Black, right? And what actually happens when you do have an asset, and what we see issues and stories highlighted in the news of thinking about home valuation and how those assets are compromised when people start to look at and assess their value. We are also looking at, again, what are those things and what is the data that we need at the individual, community, and institutional level that still does not exist around many of the things that Bill just mentioned, right? And so, I'm broadening the question a little bit more and saying, as we just think about the framing of what it is going to take to get to wealth, because data for the sake of data, it's, not even useful or helpful, but we are looking at what is a broader definition that considers, culture, that considers, the history, that we will have to find data around, that we will have to be in partnership and start to think about moving forward. So that's what's top of mind and part of what we're trying to do as we grapple with, again, opportunities to partner to actually create, some type of movement. The last thing I would say is Bill gave a fact that, really resonates with Mike. He says that all the time about the differential in the average net worth of Black families versus white families, but it also is just that grand number of that the Black community only holds 1% of wealth in the country. And if we think about that in itself, it is, it's a huge problem that's interconnected. And so as we start moving towards action and solutions, we have to be thinking about the interconnectivity, again, across sectors and across issues to really create some change.
Yeah, thank you for that. And building on that, Maria, I'm hoping you can address, we saw so many Americans calling out corporate America during the rise of the Black Lives Matters movement, saying that broad diversity and inclusion initiatives aren't enough to shift the needle on inequity. Do you believe we could see a shift in the needle if corporate America paid all of their employees a living wage? And how to even think about that?
Yeah, thank you for the question, and thank you both for your previous answers. I think we can move the needle. I think, so if I look at even the influence that we've been able to have with 85 customers, so 85 companies who have committed to pay employees fairly, they typically do remediation, which means they fix pay to the tune of about 1 to 1.3 million. So what you figure is amongst those 85 companies, you've put about $85 million back into the pockets of people that were not getting it because of their gender, race, ethnicity. And I think if all companies committed to doing that, you now have something that is so critical to the future of what you make across time, because starting pay is the biggest factor in pay over time. So if you start just 7% below someone else in a job where you're doing the same work, even if you are making incrementally more in performance increases year over year, it will take you 7 years at a 3% addition in performance. So what I'm saying is if we're making the same and I start out higher than you, it's going to take you 7 years to catch up with me, even if you're making 3% more than me every year in those incremental bumps. So that's tremendous. And if you think about that and multiply that over the course of someone's career, if companies can begin paying fairly, and let's not even talk about back pay yet, right? If you want to think about back pay, that's next. But if we just start today by making sure people are paid fairly, that has a tremendous impact on what they're able to make over the next 20, 30, 40 years. And that has economic implications that go far beyond the living wage. It impacts children, it impacts childcare decisions, it impacts ability to move up, move laterally, move from company to company. And so I think, even HBR came out with an article right in the midst of the early stages of the Black Lives Matter movement. And they had 10 things that companies need to do to commit to racial injustice. And pay equity was number 2, and fair wage was number 8. So 2 things out of 10 were committing to paying people fairly. And I think it can make a difference when you look at it over the course of someone's lifetime and over the course of what a simple remediation in pay can do when you compound it over the next several years in a career.
Last question for all of you. What is at stake? And if you can keep your answer to like 30, 45 seconds, all right? But this is an important one. So pack in. What is at stake if we don't act to address the current disparities seen within our economic system? Garnisha, Maria, and then Bill, bring us home.
I would just say that if we continue as we are, we're only going to see, a million times more of the inequity that we currently see. All the data is already there. I think it is a loss in, our social, our cultural fabric. It's a loss in the genius that exists within individuals and businesses and organizations. And, it is a loss of opportunity for us to actually use this moment that we're in right now, not to get back to normal, because normal wasn't good for Black people, but to actually to re-envision and break down some of the things that have been destructive historically in our culture and in our communities.
Thank you.
I think the risk here is that we are going to continue to see women and people of color and Black women specifically drop out of the workforce in droves. And I think we're seeing it. I think if we continue with some of the systemic issues that do not enable women and people of color to encounter success in a career where they're working very hard and very diligently, if we continue to not enable them to bring their whole selves to work, I think we are going to start to see a breakdown of hope and an increase in hopelessness that results in higher unemployment, that results in lower productivity amongst companies, lower GDP. I think we will start to see a real breakdown in talent that is willing to come to work, to a workplace, and it can get very dire. So I think these are issues that when we look at the workplace and we look at fairness, we've got to figure this out at a foundational level.
Thank you. Bill?
I think our survival is at stake. I think we're fooling ourselves if we don't look around and realize that we are virtually in the middle of a civil war. And I don't think I'm being over dramatic. We're seeing it in the streets as arms that are killing people. We are pitting people against each other. And I think that it's not where we have to be. I think if we make investments in communities in ways that we would want our own communities to be invested in, value people, respect science, respect the environment, respect each other, we'll see the kind of outcomes that I think will get us on the other side of this. But right now, we're not heading in the right direction. I think we've got to invest in frontline first responder organizations that are in these communities, helping people, providing a lifeline, and investing in ways that create opportunities for people of color. But if we don't do basic things, if we don't start empowering people and respecting each other, we are in for some dark days ahead.
Bill, Maria, Garnisha, what a pleasure. I have learned so much today. I look forward to spending more time with all of you in partnership. Hold me accountable. We must make things better. We must make things better. Mitch, I'm going to hand it over to you to close us out today.
Fern, thanks so much for doing a great job today. And Bill and Maria and Garnisha, thank you for a great conversation. I think Bill hit it, on the head. We have to stop doing the damage that we're doing, repair the damage that we have done, begin to redesign the systems that created the damage in the first place, and continue to move forward intentionally, aggressively, in a focused way, because nothing less than the future of the country as we hoped she would be is at stake. Thank you all for your specific recommendations. I want to encourage our listeners to actually continue to engage on specific ways, not just what to do, but how to do it. Absolutely appreciate your insights and your knowledge, and look forward to having everyone join us next Thursday for my conversation with Stacey Abrams about democracy in America. See you all then. Thank you so much for joining us today.